Preventing and responding to incidents of domestic terrorism requires federal, state, and local assets to work together. GAO recently reported that the existing national strategy is missing some key information that could clarify roles and missions. Here with more is the Director of Homeland Security and Justice Issues at GAO, Triana McNeil. Triana, thanks so much for joining me again.
Thank you for having me.
You've got a new report out that I think should be a blockbuster, a bestseller, implementing an effective national strategy to address domestic terrorism. Such an important topic. It's good to know there is a strategy. Let's start with who's responsible for it.
So the National Security Council, they authored this strategy and they coordinate with a number of key agencies to implement it. And of course, they got a lot of input from a lot of these agencies. So in addition to the National Security Council, you've got the Department of Homeland Security, you've got the FBI, you've got the National Counterterrorism Center, you've got the Office of Director of National Intelligence, as well as Treasury, VA, Health Human Services, as well as DOD. Some of those might surprise people, but to counter domestic terrorism, it really does take an all-of-government approach.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say a whole-of-government approach. So, as I said, it's good to know there is a strategy. When was this strategy last updated?
So the strategy that we reviewed was issued in 2021. And one of the first things that we did, we tried to understand if the basis for what that strategy was built upon, if the threat landscape was still current and accurate. And we found that it was. So we looked at the threat assessments that the federal government produced from 2021 to 2024. And the top threats since 2021 were still persisting. Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism and anti-government or anti-authority were really those top ones, and they're still relevant today.
I suspect there's a lot that happens that even doesn't get captured in the news headlines. So, again, it's good to hear that the threat assessment that the strategy is built on still holds.
Yes.
As GAO investigates these sorts of, or assesses these sorts of whole-of-government strategies, you have a framework that you use to compare. You've got 6 categories or 6 factors in the framework. What are those that you look for in an effective national strategy about anything?
The first one is purpose, scope, methodology. And we really want to understand, is this strategy, does it encompass clarity and focus? When someone picks it up, do they understand what the strategy is covering? The second element or characteristic is problem definition and risk assessment, which would include things like analysis of threats and vulnerabilities to critical assets in this case. And the third characteristic is defining organizational roles, responsibilities. How are they supposed to coordinate? The fourth characteristic is all about the goals and performance measures and how you track progress that's being made. The fifth characteristic is about integration and implementation. And the most, I won't say most important, but very important characteristic is resource and investments. You might lay out all these different activities, but without having committed resources, it's going to be hard to successfully implement and achieve the goals and the strategy.
I'm speaking with Triana McNeil, Director of Homeland Security and Justice Issues at the Government Accountability Office. So, Triana, in light of that framework, how did this strategy fare?
What we found was a lot of steps had been taken by the Biden administration. So there were 4 pillars outlined in this strategy: sharing information, preventing domestic terrorism, disrupting and deterring domestic terrorism, and confronting long-term contributors. And they had specific activities for each of those 4 pillars. It totaled 58 activities across all these different agencies that needed to occur. We found that 48 of the 58 they had done some type of activity. So there was a lot of movement and action. However, when you look at the strategy with those 6 desirable characteristics in mind, it fell short on a number of fronts. So we gave credit, yes, there was purpose and scope in the strategy. Problem was defined. Was there a risk assessment, analysis of threats and vulnerabilities to critical assets? No. Organizational roles, responsibilities, coordination. I think that just because a lot of these agencies have statutory missions, they were able to define to a certain extent organizational roles and responsibilities, but they were lacking on a number of fronts. I think for the federal agencies, there was some clarity, but it really lacked information about how non-federal partners were to contribute to countering domestic terrorism. The state and locals that we spoke with really lacked any kind of insight into the role that they could play, and they play a critical role. And then when you're looking at the integration of this strategy with the other more agency-specific plans and activities that they have in place, there was improvement needed there. And there was virtually no mention of resource and investment commitment.
It sounds a little bit like they captured the low-hanging fruit, but the hard stuff got left behind.
That's right. And this was the first of its kind. And so when we talk to the people that helped develop the strategy, and when we talk to other players in this arena, folks were excited that someone had put pen to paper and really tried to focus with putting national attention on this. But everyone recognized it was a first step, and it really didn't meet the mark in terms of a substantive national strategy. So, every administration might come in and create its own national strategy based on its priorities. And what we found towards the end of our report, the Biden administration was going out, the new Trump administration was coming in, and it was made clear to us that this 2021 strategy would likely be replaced. And so the latest information that we have is within a month or so, we might see the new Trump administration's domestic terrorism strategy. And I really hope that they use this report as a guide as they're developing their new strategy.
Absolutely.
Time will tell.
You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here, and that level of coordination is so complex, especially when it's cross-agency but also cross-level. This is a real intergovernmental problem. So let's just talk maybe about one recommendation, how to bring the non-federal partners into this collaboration. What does GAO suggest?
We recommended that DHS and DOJ better communicate how they are countering domestic terrorism with their non-federal partners, and to explain and prioritize how state and locals specifically, but also private sector partners, can contribute to that effort. And so when we were looking at the 2021 strategy, it was a thin public document. The Meteor document that really laid out some of the granular level details and activities that each individual agency would play to achieve the goals, that was classified. It was recently made public earlier in April. Having a document like that is what the state and locals were telling us they needed. They did not see that classified document, and that would have provided them much more insight into the roles that they could play. So that's the type of recommendation that we made to both DOJ and DHS.
Triana, thanks so much for sharing this report. As I said at the beginning, I really think this ought to be on everybody's reading list. It's such an important issue and requires so much partnership. Triana McNeil is the Director of Homeland Security and Justice Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Thanks so much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview along with a link to this report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.